Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a deep amber hue over the kingdom of Valtoria. Eric stood at the edge of his village, staring into the distance where the capital's spires glinted faintly in the fading light. The rumors of war had spread, as they always did, carried by merchants and travelers fleeing from the Eastern Front. For months, Valtoria had struggled against the invaders, and now the enemy was nearly at the gates. But to Eric, the war felt as distant as the glittering towers. The real battle, the one he fought every day, was within himself. He had spent his life in the shadow of his father, a knight whose death in battle left their family in disgrace. Eric had long dreamed of following in his father's footsteps, of donning the armor and wielding the sword, but every attempt to enlist had been met with rejection. "Go home, boy," the seasoned soldiers had told him. "You're not ready. We need real fighters, not some farmer's son trying to play at war." Their words stung, but Eric had been used to such dismissals. His father had been a hero once, but that reputation hadn't saved him from a dishonorable death in the eyes of the kingdom. Eric knew that without proving himself, he was nothing more than a boy with lofty dreams. And so, when he heard the old hermit in the village square, speaking of a long-lost prophecy and a sword of legend, something stirred inside him. The hermit was hunched and weathered, his eyes clouded, but his voice held an eerie strength. "The sword of Lumina," he whispered to the gathering crowd, "lost for centuries, yet waiting to be claimed. Only the pure of heart, the leader of men, can awaken its power." The crowd mostly ignored the old man, brushing off his words as the ramblings of a madman, but Eric lingered. The thought of finding Lumina, the sword that once united the realm, tugged at him. What if this was his chance? What if finding the sword would prove his worth not just to the kingdom, but to himself? That night, Eric packed a small bag with provisions. His mother didn't question him when she saw his determined face. She only pressed a hand to his cheek and whispered, "May your path be blessed, my son." And so, before dawn broke, Eric set off. The road ahead was long, winding through forests and across rivers, taking him far from the village he had known all his life. For days, he traveled alone, each step heavy with uncertainty. The more miles he put behind him, the further his doubts grew. What made him think he could do this? He wasn't a hero, just a boy chasing legends. But Eric pressed on, refusing to turn back. His path led him deeper into the wilds, where the land itself seemed to test him. Dark woods closed in, and strange sounds echoed through the trees. More than once, he felt eyes watching him from the shadows. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at him, Eric continued. He had to. There was no other choice. It was on the fifth night, as he camped by a quiet stream, that he met his first companion. Eric had been tending to his fire, the crackling flames a comfort in the darkness, when he heard a rustling from the nearby bushes. He reached for his sword, though it was a simple blade, nothing like the fabled Lumina, and held it ready. From the shadows stepped a figure, slim and quick, with a smirk playing across his lips. He was dressed in dark, worn leathers, the kind a rogue might wear, and his eyes gleamed mischievously in the firelight. "Easy there, lad," the stranger said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "No need to gut me just yet. Name's Kale. And judging by your fire and that sorry look on your face, you could use some company." Eric hesitated but lowered his blade. "I'm not looking for trouble." Kale chuckled, stepping closer. "Neither am I. But trouble tends to find me anyway. So, where's a farm boy like you heading all alone in these parts? There are worse things than bandits out here." Eric considered lying but found himself blurting out the truth. "I'm looking for Lumina, the lost sword." Cale's eyes widened, then he let out a hearty laugh. "Lumina? You're serious? You're after a sword that no one's seen in centuries? You've got guts, I'll give you that." "I'll find it," Eric said firmly, his fists clenched. "I have to." Cale's laughter died down, replaced by a thoughtful look. "Well, I've heard crazier things. Tell you what, I'll tag along. You're bound to get yourself killed out here, and that's bad for business." "What business?" Cale grinned. "Looting bodies, of course." Despite himself, Eric smirked. He didn't entirely trust Cale, but something told him the rogue might prove useful. The unlikely pair traveled together for several more days, their path leading them through dense forests and jagged hills. Cale was good company, despite his constant wisecracks. He had a talent for avoiding trouble, or finding it when it suited him, and his skills with a dagger were nothing to scoff at. But Eric could never quite shake the feeling that Cale was hiding something. As they traveled, Eric's mind remained fixed on Lumina. He found himself dreaming of the sword, a gleaming blade bathed in light, waiting for him in some forgotten corner of the world. But the closer they came to their destination, the more his doubts gnawed at him. What if the sword was nothing more than a myth? What if he wasn't the one destined to wield it? Their journey took a turn when they reached the foot of the Iron Peak Mountains. The terrain became treacherous, and Eric could feel the weight of the challenge ahead. Cale seemed to sense it too, his usual banter fading as the path grew steeper. It was here, in the shadow of the mountains, that they encountered another traveler, Allure, a warrior from the northern lands. She stood taller than both Eric and Cale, her broad shoulders and scarred armor marking her as a seasoned fighter. Her gaze was sharp, assessing them with suspicion. "You two don't belong here," Allure said flatly, her hand resting on the hilt of her great sword. "We're just passing through," Cale said, his tone light. "No need to get all threatening." Allure's eyes narrowed. "This path leads to danger. The mountains aren't for the faint of heart." Eric stepped forward, feeling a surge of determination. "We're looking for Lumina, the sword of legend." Allure's expression softened, but only slightly. "Many have sought that sword. None have found it." "I will," Eric insisted. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then you'll need all the help you can get. The path ahead is treacherous, and the enemies you'll face will not show mercy. I'll travel with you, for now. But make no mistake, if you prove a burden, I won't hesitate to leave you behind." With Allure now leading the way, the journey became even more grueling. The mountains were unforgiving, their jagged peaks rising like teeth into the sky. The wind howled through the passes, and the cold bit at their skin. But Eric found himself growing stronger with each step. Allure was a harsh teacher, but a fair one. She taught him the basics of swordsmanship, showing him how to block, parry, and strike with precision. Under her tutelage, Eric began to feel like a true warrior, yet, even as he improved, the weight of the prophecy bore down on him. Could he truly be the one destined to find Lumina? Or was he chasing an impossible dream? The wind howled around the trio as they pressed forward through the Iron Peak Mountains. Eric's hands were numb from the cold, but Allure's relentless pace forced him to keep moving. Each step was a struggle, the jagged rocks beneath their feet making progress slow and treacherous. But Eric barely noticed the discomfort anymore. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Lumina and the challenges that lay ahead. Allure had been right about one thing: the path was dangerous. In the days since she'd joined their group, they had faced ambushes from mountain bandits and attacks by wolves with eyes glowing unnaturally in the dark. Eric had fought alongside Kale and Alara, and with each skirmish, he felt a small piece of his doubt begin to fade. His swordsmanship had improved, his strikes more confident, and his instincts sharper. Still, he knew that these battles were nothing compared to the final test that awaited him. They made camp in a narrow valley, the peaks towering above them like silent sentinels. Eric sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. Kale was off tending to his daggers, a constant habit of his, while Alara sat across from Eric, sharpening her great sword with methodical precision. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice low. Eric shrugged, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. "Just thinking." "About the sword?" "About everything," Eric admitted. "What if we get there, and I'm not worthy? What if I've been chasing a myth all this time?" Alara looked up from her blade, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's the thing about legends. They have a way of revealing more than you expect. Whether or not you find Lumina, this journey has changed you. You're not the boy I met at the foot of these mountains." Eric frowned. "But what if I fail?" Kale, who had been eavesdropping as usual, wandered over and flopped down beside Eric. "Look, kid. Everyone's afraid of failing. But the only real failure is giving up. Besides," he added with a smirk, "I didn't come all this way for nothing. If we don't find that sword, I'll be more disappointed than you." Alara shot him a glare. "This isn't a joke, Kale." I know," Kale said, raising his hands defensively. "But he's got to lighten up a little, or he'll crack under the pressure." Eric couldn't help but smile faintly. For all his bravado, Kale's words held some truth. He had come too far to turn back now. Whatever awaited him at the end of this journey, he would face it head-on. The next day, they reached the base of a massive cliff, the final obstacle standing between them and the hidden fortress where Lumina was said to rest. The ancient ruins loomed in the distance, half buried by snow and time, but there was no obvious path forward. The cliff was steep and treacherous, the kind of climb that could easily end in disaster. "We climb," Alara said simply, strapping her sword to her back. Eric stared up at the cliff, doubt gnawing at him again. "That's a sheer drop. One wrong move and we're finished." "You're welcome to stay here," Kale quipped, already testing the first few handholds. "But I doubt you came all this way just to turn back." With a deep breath, Eric followed. The climb was slow and grueling, every muscle in his body straining as he pulled himself up, inch by inch. His fingers were raw from gripping the cold, jagged rock, and several times he thought he would lose his hold. But Alara's steady pace and Kale's snarky encouragement from above kept him going. They had become more than companions on this journey, they were a team. Hours later, they finally reached the top, collapsing onto the snowy ground, breathing hard. The fortress loomed ahead, half hidden in the swirling mist. Its ancient stone walls were cracked and weathered, but there was an undeniable power about the place. It was as though the very air hummed with magic. "This is it," Eric whispered, his breath misting in the cold air. He could feel it in his bones. Lumina was here, waiting for him. They approached cautiously, stepping through the crumbling archway that led into the heart of the fortress. The interior was dark, the only light coming from cracks in the stone ceiling where faint beams of sunlight filtered through. The silence was oppressive, as if the very stones were holding their breath. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it rested a sword unlike any Eric had ever seen. Lumina. Its blade gleamed faintly even in the dim light, and the intricate runes etched along its length seemed to pulse with life. but Eric's path was blocked. A figure stood before the pedestal, its form cloaked in shadow. As Eric drew closer, the figure turned, revealing the face of his father. Eric froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It couldn't be. His father had died in battle years ago, leaving Eric to bear the weight of his legacy alone. Yet here he was, standing before him, whole and unbroken. "Father?" Eric whispered, his voice trembling. The figure's eyes were cold, hard as steel. "You think you're worthy of this sword?" the apparition said, its voice a low growl. "You, a boy playing at being a warrior? You're nothing. You'll never live up to the name I gave you." Eric's blood ran cold. His greatest fear had come to life, standing before him in the form of the man he had admired most. Every doubt, every moment of hesitation, crashed over him like a wave. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't ready. The figure took a step forward, drawing its own blade. "Prove yourself, if you can." The duel began in an instant, the clang of steel echoing through the chamber. Eric parried the first blow, barely able to keep up with the speed and precision of his opponent. His father's movements were fluid, graceful, the strikes landing with deadly accuracy. Eric stumbled, his feet slipping on the cold stone floor, his confidence shattered. "Is this the best you can do?" the figure taunted. "You're weak. Unworthy. You'll never be a true warrior." Each word was like a dagger to Eric's heart, and for a moment, he almost believed it. But then he remembered Alara's words, the lessons she had drilled into him during their journey. He remembered Kale's laughter, the way the rogue had always managed to find light even in the darkest moments. And he remembered why he had started this journey in the first place, not to live up to his father's legacy, but to find his own path. With a roar, Eric pushed forward, his blade flashing as he parried the next strike. The figure hesitated for a split second, and that was all Eric needed. He struck with all his might, knocking the sword from the apparition's hand. The figure staggered back, its form flickering like a shadow. Eric raised his sword for the final blow, but before he could strike, the figure dissolved into mist, disappearing into the air. The chamber fell silent once more. Breathing heavily, Eric turned toward the pedestal. The sword of Lumina awaited him, its glow brighter now, as though recognizing his victory. Slowly, he approached and reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the hilt. A surge of power coursed through him the moment his fingers wrapped around the sword. It was as though Lumina itself was alive, responding to his touch, its energy filling him with a strength he had never known. Eric could feel the weight of its history, the countless battles it had seen, and the responsibility it carried. But he no longer felt fear. He had proven himself, not to his father, not to the kingdom, but to himself. Eric sheathed Lumina at his side and turned to face Alara and Kale, who had been watching silently. Alara gave him a small nod of approval, while Kale grinned broadly. "Took you long enough," Kale said. "Now let's go save the kingdom, shall we?" They descended the mountain with a new sense of purpose. The sword at Eric's side felt like a beacon, its power radiating through him with every step. By the time they reached the capital, the city was under siege. The invaders had breached the outer defenses, and the royal army was on the verge of collapse, but Eric did not hesitate. With Lumina in hand, he rallied the remaining soldiers, leading the charge against the enemy. His companions fought beside him, their skills honed by the trials they had faced together. The battle was fierce, but Eric's leadership and the sword's power turned the tide. In the end, Eric found himself face to face with the enemy commander, a dark knight wielding a cursed blade. Their duel was the fiercest yet, the clash of steel ringing through the battlefield. But Eric had learned more than just swordsmanship on his journey. He had learned the true meaning of unity and leadership. And in that moment, he knew he was ready. With a final, powerful strike, Eric shattered the cursed blade, defeating the Dark Knight. The enemy forces scattered, their morale broken, and the kingdom was saved. As the sun rose over the battlefield, Eric stood tall, lumina gleaming in his hand. The war was over, but his journey had just begun. He had found his path, not as the shadow of his father, but as a hero in his own right.